And then we increased the supply, which was becoming rather short. And we made all kinds of accomplishments like that. We're still great friends. Brown ran for governor in Ohio and lost, but he still comes through Washington, and I still see him. We're still great friends.
1994 must have been a particularly dramatic time in terms of leadership and control in the House. That really marked your first time in the minority?
Yeah. I knew what was coming. Dad had been in the minority, and he knew exactly what the Republicans do to you when you get in the minority. So I was not surprised. But Tom Bliley, who became the chairman of the committee, and I were good friends, and we worked together as best we could. I've always known how to work positively with people, and I've always known how to function as a one-man wrecking crew. And Tom Bliley, when he was chairman, or Billy Tozan, or any of my Republican colleagues who became chairman, including Joe Barton, who's a great friend of mine, the last Republican chairman, they knew that it was less painful to work with me. And I was able to sell the Democrats on the thesis that they had to stay together. And we worked very hard to hold them together and see that they were not the kind of rabble that Democrats instinctively want to become. And the result was that it was a hard experience, but we stopped a lot of things from being worse, as bad as they could be, including Bush's Social Security reform, which he tried to shove through to privatize Social Security. We said, this ain't going to happen, and thank God it didn't.
Given what's happened to private market. How would you compare Speaker Rayburn and Gingrich?
Rayburn was a giant. Rayburn understood what the House does, and he was an institutionalist. And Rayburn was a guy who knew how to use power. When I used to displease Rayburn, I'd get a look from him that would melt the buckles on my belt. But he would always use his power carefully. You knew you were going to pay if you crossed him, but you never knew quite when, and you didn't particularly look forward to the opportunity. He led the party well. He was a real innovator. Wrote law, regulated securities. He was responsible for passage of Glass-Steagall, railroad retirement, a whole wide array of legislation. And curiously enough, he was largely a participant in the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of '57, which was the first since the Civil War. He was reputed to be a bachelor, which in fact he was not. He'd been married briefly in a rather disastrous marriage. He lived to be Speaker. Came from a place called Bonham, Texas, the smallest congressional district in the United States. And every time there'd be some Republicans appear, why the legislature would cut that part of the district out, so it kept getting smaller. But he was a great speaker, and he understood how to run the House, and he did. The House ran well when he was Speaker. Gingrich came in, and he was going to reform the world. And Gingrich's a friend of mine. I'm fond personally of him, and we've traveled together and done a lot of things. But I don't agree with him on a lot of things in substance, and a lot of his procedural and political moves I find very distressing. Gingrich came in and he remade the business. Everything was run out of the Speaker's office. And he used the Rules Committee to create rules that enable him to run the place in the most unquestioned way. And he passed a lot of legislation that he probably couldn't have passed had he done it in a more democratic, with a small d, way. He didn't rewrite the rules, but he began to select the rules that he would use and how he would use them. He's a little bit like Cannon, who was a Republican Speaker back around the turn of the century. And Cannon, who was called Dictator Cannon, or Tyrant Cannon, made himself chairman of everything, just about. He was chairman of the Rules Committee. And when the Rules Committee would meet in the morning to decide on the business of the day, he'd say, gentlemen, what outrage are we going to commit today?
Okay.
Gingrich never said that, but we knew that was coming. And of course, Gingrich's rules have been found to be very convenient by our current leadership, so they're in effect using his rules. And of course, the Republicans are screaming, but and I don't really approve of the way that's being done, but I just tell the Republicans, well, you've got a lot of gall squawking about it, because all the Democrats are doing is doing to you what you did to us.
They, how did you become chair of Energy and Commerce Committee? Was that
seniority system?
But is that the committee you wanted to serve on and
Yeah.
chair, or
I wanted the Ways and Means Committee, which was Dad's committee. Sam Rayburn kept me off of it because he thought I was too radical, and I was, but I've got better sense since.
radical in what sense?
Liberal, and I was not too faithful in following the leadership. I was a pretty independent fellow. I still am. But then I wanted to get on Commerce Committee, which I thought was the biggest and the best committee in the Congress. And so at the beginning of my second term, I ran, and I got elected. Had a fight with a fellow by the name of John Moss from California, who became my dearest friend. Sat next to each other for better than 20 years on the committee. And we ran the committee. It was always my expectation that John would be the chairman and I would be the guy who picked his enemies off his back. But John quit and died later. And so when the time came, I became chairman of the committee. And I think I ran the committee very, very effectively and very well.
You made the committee aggressive in investigating various commercial activities.
We investigated almost everything. I first led a revolt against Staggers to make John Moss the chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee so that we'd have that vigorous oversight policy, because that's one of the major functions of the Congress.
So you had essentially taken some oversight role he saw as taking it away from the Oversight Committee.
No, adding it to the Oversight Committee, seeing to it that the Oversight Committee would function vigorously to see to it that things within the jurisdiction of the committee were properly supervised.
Yeah, okay.
That's a very important congressional function. It goes back to the British Parliament and back to the 1600s. It's not something which is new. And it was something which Rayburn did very vigorously. And it was something that fell into disuse. And so Moss and I reinvigorated that function of the committee. And then when I became chairman, I became also chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee. And we ran a tremendous Oversight Subcommittee. I did vigorous oversight when I was chairman of both the subcommittees on fisheries and wildlife conservation, stopped the natives up in Alaska from stealing better than 4 million acres of land, saw to it that conservation monies were properly spent, wrote a lot of legislation, including the National Environmental Policy Act. Then when I became a subcommittee chairman on the Commerce Committee, I ran it the same way. We did vigorous oversight. We made the oil industry give back $11 billion in overpayments. We put folks in jail for serious misbehavior, violation of law. Then when I got to be chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee, we investigated handling of government contracts, theft of public monies. We'd make defense contractors and other contractors in government give back about $1 billion a year. We stopped things like dog boarding at public expense by defense contractors and all kinds of things like that. We found the $600 toilet seats.
Okay.
We found all kinds of things like that. We found pliers that would cost $100, and we uh, stopped all manner of bad practices.